Um, what if the very things we spend our entire lives running away from, things like weakness, darkness, uncertainty, and just the general tension of conflict, what if those are actually the exact engines required for human wisdom?
That is quite the question to start with. But it's so relevant because we spend so much energy trying to optimize our lives, right? Trying to
Yeah.
eradicate our flaws and chase this absolute clarity.
Yeah, exactly. We're constantly attempting to stand purely in the light, like all the time. But today we are stepping into a very different kind of space. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Thank you. And for you listening, today we're opening chapter 17 of Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. And I have to say, the philosophy embedded in this text completely upends that modern instinct we were just talking about.
It really does. Today we are examining the esoteric figure known as the Knight of the East and West. And the fundamental premise here is that wisdom is not found by escaping the tension of opposites.
Right. It is found by stepping directly into the center of it, which is a profound pivot from the previous chapter, if you recall.
Oh, yeah. The prior chapter was heavily focused on, the external mechanisms of leadership.
Exactly. It was all about how an individual operates in the public square, the pragmatic realities of duty, and outward-facing responsibility. But chapter 17 turns the lens inward.
So, the Knight of the East and West, even just the title itself gives us a map for what we are about to explore.
It does. In the traditions this text draws from, the East traditionally symbolizes the origin of light, ancient spiritual wisdom, and, the internal contemplative mind.
While the West represents the setting sun, the material world, action, and just pragmatic reality.
Precisely. So the night is quite literally the bridge between the spiritual and the material.
Which implies a state of being pulled in two directions simultaneously. I mean, that sounds exhausting.
It is. But it brings us to the core question of this deep dive, a question that feels, honestly, increasingly urgent for anyone trying to navigate our hyperpolarized reality right now.
Right. Which is, how do we find equilibrium in a world and a mind that is fundamentally defined by opposing forces?
Exactly. When everything is demanding that you choose a side, light or dark, action or reflection, strength or weakness, how do you actually maintain your center?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the source material doesn't just offer some superficial self-help technique, does it?
No, not at all. It constructs a rigorous philosophical framework. The roadmap of our discussion today begins with the ontology of duality, understanding that opposites are a structural requirement of reality.
And from there, it warns us about the psychological trap of the pendulum, right? That human instinct to just seek the false comfort of extremes.
Right. And then it demands that we entirely reevaluate our relationship with light and darkness. It basically proposes that mystery and uncertainty are biological and spiritual necessities for growth.
Wow. And then it moves into the mechanics of how internal equilibrium dictates external reality.
Yes, before finally arriving at the summit, which is the concept of integration. The ultimate goal of the night is not to find a lukewarm compromise between two extremes.
Right. It's about alchemizing opposing truths into a higher unified wisdom, which is just a staggering amount of philosophical territory to cover.
It really is, and it demands that we abandon some of our most ingrained cultural programming.
So let's establish the foundational premise of the chapter, because before we can talk about finding balance, we have to understand the landscape we are trying to balance on.
Exactly. And the text explicitly outlines the architecture of existence as being defined by duality.
Right. It lists these perpetual tensions, things like light and darkness, good and evil, strength and weakness, action and reflection.
And in our modern context, we often view these tensions as problems to be solved. We view the friction between them as a glitch in the human operating system.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to ask about. Is duality a bug or a feature in the system of life? Because when we experience the tension between, say, action and reflection, it usually feels like a glitch we need to fix.
And the text draws a very hard line against that perspective. The Knight of the East and West is taught that duality is not a flaw. It is not a glitch.
So it's intentional.
It is the fundamental, inescapable feature that makes existence possible. Think about a monistic universe. A universe of only one pole, only one temperature, only one state of being.
It would just be stagnant.
Completely. It's a universe incapable of experiencing itself. There's a concept in thermodynamics that illustrates this perfectly, actually.
Oh, I love a good physics analogy. Hit me.
So if a system reaches a state of absolute equilibrium, where there is no temperature differential, no hot and no cold, you reach what is called heat death.
Wow, heat death.
Yeah. No work can be done. No energy can flow. Life motion and consciousness require a differential. They absolutely require polarity.
So the tension is the current. It is the energy that drives the system forward.
Precisely.
Let's bring that abstract concept down to the specific dualities Pike outlines in the text. I want to start with the tension between good and evil.
That's a heavy one to start with, but essential.
Right, because in a practical psychological sense, how does this tension function for the initiate? If duality is a necessary feature, that implies the capacity for evil is also a necessary feature.
It does.
And I mean, for you listening, that is a deeply uncomfortable idea to hold.
It is very uncomfortable, but esoterically, it is morally necessary. If you examine the internal landscape of the human mind, the tension between good and evil is the friction of moral agency.
Moral agency, meaning the ability to actually choose.
Exactly. Imagine if a human being were simply programmed to only ever execute benevolent actions. Like if they lacked the physical, psychological, or intellectual capacity to cause harm.
Then their goodness wouldn't really mean anything, would it?
Right. Their goodness would carry no moral weight. It would be an automated reflex, no different than a stone falling to the ground due to gravity.
So the esoteric perspective is that the presence of the shadow, the internal capacity for destruction or selfishness, is the exact counterweight that gives the choice of goodness its value.
Exactly. The choice requires an alternative.
Right, because if there is no alternative, there is no virtue.
Furthermore, the knight understands that pretending this duality does not exist within oneself is a form of dangerous naivete.
Oh, interesting. So you can't just ignore the dark side.
No. The text suggests that you manage the tension not by denying your capacity for darkness, but by maintaining a vigilant, conscious awareness of both capacities and actively choosing the alignment of the East, the light.
That friction forces you to stay awake at the wheel of your own morality. It reframes morality from a static identity like, oh, I'm a good person, into an active daily discipline.
Yes, an active moment-to-moment discipline.
Let's look at the next polarity. The text highlights strength and weakness. I want to push back on the cultural narrative here because we are immersed in an optimization culture.
Oh, heavily. Everything is about hacking and optimizing.
Right. And that culture insists weakness is something to be eradicated, hacked, or just hidden. We want to be relentless. We want to be impervious.
But the text treats weakness as a necessary pole in the duality.
Exactly. So what is the actual mechanism of weakness that makes it valuable? Why do we need it?
To understand the value of weakness, we really have to look at the mechanics of structural integrity, both physical and psychological. Let's look at metallurgy.
Okay, the process of forging a sword, which is quite fitting for a knight.
Very fitting. So pure iron is incredibly hard. It is the absolute epitome of rigid strength.
But because it is so rigid, it is brittle.
Right, exactly. If pure iron strikes armor with enough force, it shatters. To make a sword that can actually survive combat, you have to introduce carbon into the iron matrix to create steel.
And what does the carbon do?
The carbon atoms disrupt the perfect, rigid lattice of the iron. They create microscopic spaces, imperfections, vulnerabilities, essentially.
Oh, so they literally introduce a structural weakness into the iron.
They do. And that specific, controlled introduction of weakness is what allows the steel to flex without breaking.
That makes perfect sense. The weakness gives the metal the capacity to absorb kinetic energy and spring back to its original shape.
Exactly. And in human psychology, an absolute, unyielding projection of strength is a brittle state.
Oh, that's such a good point.
A person who refuses to acknowledge their fatigue, their emotional vulnerability, or, the limits of their knowledge, is setting themselves up for a catastrophic shatter.
So the Knight of the East and West embraces the polarity.
Yes. They understand that their vulnerabilities, their moments of necessary rest, and their capacity to yield are the carbon that tempers their character.
It allows them to endure the shocks of life without losing their fundamental structure. The vulnerability provides the flexibility required for survival.
Which is a far more sophisticated model of resilience than simply gritting your teeth forever.
It really is. And this seamlessly brings us to the tension between action and reflection. I feel like this is perhaps the most operational duality we deal with on a random Tuesday morning.
Oh, absolutely. It's an everyday struggle.
The text warns against acting without reflecting and reflecting without acting. Let's dissect the cognitive burden of this specific polarity.
Well, the difficulty with this polarity lies in the cognitive load required to transition between the two states. Action is kinetic, right?
Right. It requires external focus, decisiveness, and a narrowing of parameters so that execution can happen.
Exactly. Whereas reflection is potential. It requires internal focus, a widening of parameters, and the deliberate suspension of execution so that variables can be analyzed.
And holding both of these states in a dynamic equilibrium is just exhausting for the human brain.
It is incredibly exhausting
Yeah.
because the brain naturally wants to default to one or the other to save energy.
It seeks the path of least resistance.
Always.
Yeah.
The person who defaults entirely to action is operating on pure momentum. They're constantly moving, constantly executing, but they're entirely reactionary.
I know so many people like that. And the cognitive trap there is the illusion of progress, isn't it?
Yes. Because they are generating heat and motion, they assume they're moving forward. But without reflection, they are often just running in circles, creating chaos.
Right. And conversely, the individual who defaults to reflection falls into the paralysis of analysis.
Exactly. They are constructing incredibly intricate, perfect models of the world in their minds. But because they never test those models against the friction of reality through action, their wisdom remains theoretical.
It is sterile.
Yes, sterile. The knight must force the integration of the two. Reflection calibrates the trajectory, and action provides the propulsion.
So to you, listening to this deep dive right now, consider your own baseline architecture. When a crisis hits or a major project lands on your desk, does your nervous system immediately push you into kinetic execution?
Like acting before the data is fully gathered.
Exactly. Or do you retreat into the safety of contemplation, researching endlessly while the window for meaningful action just closes?
Identifying your natural bias within this duality is the absolute prerequisite for the philosophical work this chapter is asking us to do.
Right, because identifying that bias reveals our susceptibility to the pendulum effect.
The peril of the pendulum.
Yes. If duality is the permanent landscape of reality, the natural human instinct is to avoid the tension of the center by running to one of the extreme edges.
And the text is incredibly stark in its warnings against this instinct. It identifies extremes not just as errors in judgment, but as profound dangers to the intellect and the spirit.
Right. The source material warns that too much of one extreme leads to instability, imbalance, and poor judgment. It outlines specific traps, rigid thinking, blind belief, and emotional overreaction.
Which are all incredibly common today.
They are, but I want to actively challenge the text here. Let's play devil's advocate for a second and look at history.
Okay, let's hear it.
The argument for balance and moderation is rational, sure, but historically, hasn't great societal change almost exclusively been driven by people who fully embraced extremes?
That is a very fair question.
Like, moderates didn't lead the American Revolution, moderates didn't end slavery, they didn't push the boundaries of science by being cautious.
Right.
Often, it seems that a degree of rigid thinking and blind belief in a cause is the exact fuel required to shatter a stagnant status quo. So why does the text condemn the very extremism that so often drives human progress?
That is probably the most common and potent critique of esoteric philosophies that prioritize balance. And to address it, we really have to distinguish between macro-societal mechanics and the micro-internal state of the initiate.
Okay, so a difference of scale.
Exactly. The text of Morals and Dogma is not a political manifesto dictating how to run a revolution. It is a manual for the architecture of the individual soul.
I see.
It is entirely true that a rigid fanatic can break a societal system. Think of a battering ram. A battering ram is an extreme tool, and it is very effective at breaking down a door.
But a battering ram cannot build a house.
Exactly. It cannot govern. It cannot sustain.
It only has one function: destruction.
Right. The danger of adopting an extreme ideology, even a seemingly righteous one, is that the ideology begins to think for you.
Oh, wow. That's chilling, actually.
This is why the text specifically warns against blind belief and rigid thinking. These are cognitive heuristics. They are shortcuts.
So when you adopt a rigid extreme, you outsource your moral and intellectual agency to a dogma.
Yes. You no longer have to evaluate the nuance of a situation. You simply apply the extreme rule. It feels like conviction, but psychologically, it is intellectual abdication.
You're just giving up your own mind.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Knight of the East and West is called to a higher, far more difficult standard, maintaining dynamic equilibrium. Truth is rarely found at the edges.
Let's explore that term, dynamic equilibrium, because the counterargument to extremism is often framed as a kind of passive fence-sitting.
Go constantly.
The moderate is seen as the person who just splits the difference and avoids taking a stand. Oh, I'm just in the middle.
Which is a complete misunderstanding of what balance actually requires. In physics, dynamic equilibrium is not a state of rest. It is a state where two opposing processes are occurring at the exact same rate.
So it's active.
Extremely active. It requires immense, continuous energy to maintain. If you think about balancing on a tightrope, the tightrope walker is not standing still.
No, they're constantly moving.
Their core is engaged, their micromuscles are firing constantly, they're shifting weight millimeter by millimeter to counter the pull of gravity on either side.
That is what the knight is doing intellectually and spiritually.
Yes. Surrendering to an extreme is actually the lazy option. It is allowing gravity to pull you completely off the rope so you can just lie flat on the ground.
Wow. Maintaining the center requires hyper-awareness and immense intellectual athleticism.
It really does.
Let's break down the mechanics of what happens when we fail to maintain that balance, specifically regarding the text's warning against emotional overreaction.
That's a critical piece of the puzzle.
The text states that this leads directly to poor judgment. So what is the actual neurobiological or psychological mechanism happening there? How does a spike in emotion actively degrade our capacity to judge reality accurately?
Well, when individual is gripped by an emotional extreme, be it rage, terror, or even profound euphoria, the psychological aperture of their mind drastically narrows.
So they get tunnel vision.
Exactly. From an evolutionary perspective, an extreme emotion is a signal that immediate survival is at stake. The brain reroutes resources away from the prefrontal cortex, which handles complex, long-term, nuanced thinking,
And pushes it where?
to the amygdala,
Yeah.
which handles immediate fight-or-flight responses.
The system intentionally drops all context to focus entirely on the threat.
Exactly. Context is the casualty of emotion. Good judgment requires the ability to hold multiple variables simultaneously, right?
Wait, to weigh historical precedent against future probability.
And to recognize the humanity of opposing actors. Emotional overreaction strips all of that away. You become a prisoner of the present second, reacting only to the loudest stimulus.
So if you act while in the grip of an extreme emotion, your judgment is inherently poor because you are operating with a severely compromised data set.
That's a great way to put it. The knight's discipline is to observe the emotion, to feel its kinetic pull, but to refuse to let it override the executive function of the mind.
That requires an incredible tolerance for discomfort. Which brings us to the most profound metaphor in this chapter, which deals directly with our tolerance for discomfort.
The duality of light and darkness.
Yes. To help the initiate understand this dynamic balance, the source material focuses heavily on the universal duality of light and darkness.
And it elevates light and darkness beyond mere environmental states. It positions them as profound symbols for the condition of human consciousness.
The text provides precise definitions here. It states that light symbolizes knowledge, truth, and clarity. Darkness symbolizes ignorance, uncertainty, and mystery.
Right.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The text makes a deeply counterintuitive claim. It says that both have essential value. Light reveals, while darkness challenges and deepens understanding.
It concludes that true wisdom is impossible without understanding both.
I find this fascinating because our entire cultural programming, practically from birth, conditions us to wage war on darkness.
Absolutely. The Enlightenment itself was an intellectual project dedicated to eradicating the shadows of mystery with the brilliant light of reason.
Yes. We demand absolute clarity. We want the room brightly lit at all times. If we have a question, we pull out our phones and access the sum of human knowledge in a fraction of a second.
We view ignorance, uncertainty, and mystery as terrifying vulnerabilities that must be immediately patched with data.
Exactly. But the philosophy of the Knight of the East and West insists that darkness has profound value. So what is the mechanism of that value? How does sitting in uncertainty actually deepen understanding?
To understand the mechanism, we really have to look at what happens to human perception in environments of absolute clarity versus environments of obscurity.
Okay, let's look at it.
In a brilliantly lit room, everything is obvious. Your eyes relax. Your brain relies heavily on visual heuristics. It quickly scans the room, categorizes the objects, and stops paying attention.
Because there's no threat, there's no unknown.
Right. Absolute clarity breeds intellectual complacency. You don't have to struggle to understand your environment, so you stop actively engaging with it.
Because the answers are handed to you without any effort.
But consider the physical and psychological shift when the lights go out. In the dark, your senses are heightened. Your pupils dilate to capture any available photons. Your hearing becomes acute.
You move with deliberate, hyper-aware caution.
Exactly. The darkness strips away your visual heuristics and forces you to actively construct your understanding of reality step by step, sound by sound.
Oh, that is such a powerful image.
Esoterically, uncertainty and mystery operate the exact same way on the mind. They strip away our cognitive complacency. If we existed in a state of pure intellectual light, where absolute truth was always glaringly obvious.
We would never develop the capacity for deep inquiry. Curiosity cannot exist without a void in knowledge. It requires a shadow.
The struggle to understand the unknown is the friction that builds the neural pathways of wisdom. In many esoteric initiation rites, the candidate is placed in a literal dark room, a chamber of reflection.
And the purpose is not to frighten them.
No, not at all. The purpose is to isolate them from the distracting light of the external world, forcing them to confront the internal mysteries.
So if you constantly eradicate ignorance the second you encounter it, you never build the intellectual resilience required to navigate truly complex, ambiguous problems where clear data does not exist.
Exactly.
That makes me view our modern relationship with information in a completely different light. No pun intended. We are terrified of not knowing something.
We really are.
And the text suggests that an intolerance for mystery leads directly back to the trap we discussed earlier, blind belief.
Huh.
Walk us through that causal chain. How does the fear of uncertainty drive a person into dogma?
Well, when an individual lacks the internal fortitude to sit in the dark, when they simply cannot tolerate the psychological discomfort of ambiguity, they become desperate for any source of light.
Just to make the discomfort stop.
Yes, and this desperation makes them highly susceptible to false certainty. If someone comes along and offers a rigid ideology, an extremist political doctrine, or a conspiracy theory, the terrified mind will latch on to it.
Not because the ideology is objectively true.
Right, but because it provides the immediate comforting illusion of absolute clarity. Blind belief is a coping mechanism for people who have not developed the discipline to endure the mystery.
We grab the closest flashlight, even if it's leading us right off a cliff, purely because we cannot stand the sensation of the darkness.
The Knight of the East and West is trained to let their eyes adjust to the dark. They recognize that uncertainty is not a failure of intellect. It is the fertile soil where profound discovery occurs.
Wisdom is not merely the accumulation of illuminated facts. It is the structural resilience built by wrestling with the unknown.
Perfectly stated.
To you, the listener, consider the uncertainties present in your life at this exact moment. The unanswerable questions about your trajectory, the ambiguous relationships, the complex problems that refuse to yield a simple answer.
The cultural instinct is to force a resolution.
Right, to artificially light the room just to end the discomfort. But what if you adopted the posture of the knight? What if you reframed that uncertainty not as an enemy, but as the necessary darkness required to force your mind into a higher state of awareness?
What might you learn if you stopped trying to flip the switch and instead sat quietly and let your eyes adjust?
That reframing is the threshold between basic intelligence and esoteric wisdom. And it demands that the philosophy we are discussing moves from abstract contemplation into rigorous internal practice.
Which perfectly transitions us into the architecture of harmony.
Yes, because the source material is adamant that the balance between light and dark, action and reflection, cannot be maintained purely through intellectual agreement.
It has to be operationalized.
And the text dictates a very specific direction for this operation. It must flow from the inside out.
The foundational rule of this section is that external equilibrium is a total illusion if it is not generated by internal stability.
The text outlines a sequence. Inner balance requires controlling emotions, maintaining mental clarity, and aligning thoughts with actions.
And the result of that internal work is outer harmony, which manifests as balanced decisions, balanced emotions, and balanced priorities. The knight avoids both excess and deficiency.
Let's dig into the causality here, because it's one thing to philosophize about light and dark, but how does the internal, invisible act of aligning thoughts with actions actually manifest as external, measurable stability in the physical world?
The mechanism here is the elimination of internal friction. Think of the human mind as an engine.
Okay.
If your thoughts are moving in one direction, perhaps you believe in the value of patience and methodical work, but your actions are moving in another. You're constantly rushing, cutting corners, reacting impulsively. You are generating internal cognitive dissonance.
And that dissonance is friction.
Exactly. It burns immense amounts of psychological energy, leading to what we might call behavioral entropy.
You are fighting yourself before you even engage with the outside world.
Yes. When the text demands the alignment of thoughts with actions, it is demanding the repair of the engine.
I see.
When an individual's deeply held values perfectly mirror their daily habits, the internal friction drops to zero. All of that conserved energy is then directed outward into the material world.
Because the internal state is clear, The external output, the decisions they make under pressure, the way they communicate, the priorities they set, becomes incredibly stable and precise.
The inner harmony literally dictates the quality and durability of the external construct.
Let's focus on the concept of balanced priorities, specifically regarding the mandate to avoid excess and deficiency. What does the application of this look like for the initiate?
A balanced priority is a practical execution of the middle path. Excess and deficiency are the two edges of the blade that destroy equilibrium. Consider a virtue like ambition, or the drive for success.
Okay, ambition.
Ambition in excess mutates into a ruthless consuming greed. The individual prioritizes the goal to such a degree that they cannibalize their own health, their ethics, and their relationships to feed the ambition. The system collapses from overheating.
The extreme burns the foundation.
Conversely, ambition in deficiency degrades into apathy and sloth. The individual refuses to engage with the material world, perhaps out of a false sense of spiritual superiority or a fear of failure, and they squander their potential, contributing nothing.
So the knight avoids both.
Yes, a balanced priority recognizes that the drive to build and achieve is necessary. It is the West, the material action, but it must be continuously harmonized with the East, the internal reflection, the ethical boundaries, the foundational relationships.
The text uses the phrase acting with awareness as the governor against these extremes. How does awareness actually function as a preventative measure?
Awareness is the deliberate insertion of a pause between stimulus and response. It is the microsecond where the knight consults their internal architecture before executing an action. Without that awareness, humans operate on an automatic reactive loop.
We react to an insult with immediate anger. We react to stress with immediate avoidance.
Right. Acting with awareness means that before the word is spoken, before the decision is finalized, the mind runs a rapid diagnostic.
Is this response born of excess or deficiency? Is it driven by the light of reason or the panic of the dark? Does this action align with my internal structure?
Exactly. That pause is where the true power of the knight resides.
It paints an incredibly compelling portrait of an ideal state. The knight of the East and West moves through the chaotic, dualistic world without being fractured by it.
They engage fully with the material reality, but they are anchored by a profound spiritual stillness.
There is no hypocrisy between their internal mind and their external life.
It is the absolute embodiment of sovereignty over oneself.
And realizing that sovereign state acts as the preparation for the ultimate summit of this chapter. As we review the progression of these ideas, it becomes clear that all of this rigorous internal discipline, acknowledging duality, refusing the comfort of extremes, sitting in the darkness, building internal alignment, it is not the final destination.
No, that's true.
The text is pushing us toward a monumental cognitive leap. We aren't just trying to survive the tension between opposing forces, we are attempting to transcend the dichotomy altogether.
This is where the philosophy elevates from practical stoicism into profound esoteric alchemy. The goal is not merely to endure the tension, but to utilize it for transformation.
The source material lays out the ultimate directive explicitly. The goal is not to choose one side of the duality over the other, but to integrate both.
Integration.
Right. The prescribed method is to understand opposing ideas, learn from both perspectives, and combine those insights into a deeper truth. The text promises that this specific process leads to higher wisdom.
It's a very specific promise.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like the ultimate goal isn't just finding a middle ground, but building something entirely new out of the two extremes. I sense that integration is fundamentally different from a standard compromise.
Oh, the distinction between compromise and integration is the difference between a political negotiation and a philosophical transmutation. What's fascinating here is that integration is an active, creative process.
Okay, unpack that. How is it different from a compromise?
Well, in the conventional world, when we are faced with two deeply opposing ideas or factions, our best-case scenario is usually compromise. But compromise is inherently subtractive.
Attractive.
If one side demands absolute structure and the other side demands absolute freedom, a compromise requires both sides to surrender a portion of their truth. They meet in a gray, lukewarm middle where neither is fully satisfied, but open conflict is avoided.
It's a dilution. Both sides water down their principles to make the mixture palatable.
Exactly. But the Knight of the East and West does not seek dilution. Integration is not subtractive. It is additive and ultimately multiplicative.
How so?
Integration is the mechanism of the Hegelian dialectic. You take the thesis, you confront it with the antithesis, And through the intense friction of holding both, you forge a synthesis.
Ah.
You extract the absolute undiluted truth at the core of the extreme structure, and you extract the absolute undiluted truth at the core of the extreme freedom. You do not water them down.
You fuse them together under massive intellectual pressure to create a completely new, higher paradigm that did not exist before.
Exactly.
Can you ground that alchemy in a concrete example? How does one actually fuse opposing truths without diluting them?
Let us return to the duality of action and reflection. A compromise between the two would yield a state of distracted, half-hearted, multitasking purpose.
You're sort of acting while sort of thinking about it.
Yeah, and the output is usually mediocre.
But integration. Integration is taking the profound depth of insight gained from absolute solitary reflection and injecting it completely into decisive kinetic action.
Oh, wow. The fusion of these two undiluted forces creates something entirely new: strategic execution. The kinetic energy is infused with profound meaning, and the deep reflection is validated by physical reality. You haven't met in the middle. You have climbed to a higher peak.
That process demands a staggering amount of intellectual humility. The text specifically dictates that the initiate must learn from both perspectives,
Yes, it does.
which implies a recognition that even the pole you naturally oppose, the extreme you fundamentally disagree with, contains a fragment of truth that is absolutely required for your own synthesis.
It is the most difficult mandate in the text. It is relatively easy to learn from the light, from the ideas that validate our worldview and comfort our biases.
Of course.
It is excruciatingly difficult to learn from the darkness, to examine the antithesis of our beliefs and acknowledge that it possesses a piece of the structural architecture we lack.
But if you dismiss an opposing concept entirely just because you find its extreme manifestation repulsive, you leave a crucial piece of truth on the table.
And without that piece, your synthesis will be flawed. Your steel will lack carbon, and your wisdom will remain incomplete.
This, the text declares, is the true definition of higher wisdom. It is not the accumulation of more illuminated facts.
Yo.
It is the cognitive and spiritual capacity to hold paradoxes in your mind, to endure the intense friction they generate, and to weave them together into a unified understanding of reality.
The knight recognizes that the universe is not a battlefield of disconnected, warring factions, but an incredibly complex tapestry woven from contrasting threads. The task is not to cut the threads, but to master the loom.
It is a majestic and demanding framework. Let us take a moment to look back down the mountain we have just climbed and just synthesize our own journey through this material today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We began by establishing the inescapable architecture of duality, the recognition that the tension between light and dark, action and reflection, good and evil, is not a flaw in the system, but the very current that generates existence.
And then we examined the perilous trap of the pendulum, dissecting how the human mind, desperate to escape cognitive load, seeks the false safety of extremes.
We identified that rigid thinking and emotional overreaction are not signs of conviction, but cognitive shortcuts that degrade our judgment.
From there, we fundamentally reimagined the shadows. We confronted the cultural obsession with artificial light and absolute certainty,
Discovering instead that the darkness of uncertainty, ambiguity, and mystery are the necessary environments that force the neuroplasticity of true wisdom.
We trace the causal chain of harmony, revealing how the internal regulation of emotion and the alignment of thought dictate the stability of our external reality.
And finally, we arrived at the summit of integration, distinguishing the tepid dilution of compromise from the profound alchemy of synthesis, where opposing truths are fused to form higher wisdom.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
And so, to you, our listener, as you step away from this deep dive and back into a world that will constantly demand you pick a side and surrender to the extremes, I offer the questions embedded in this philosophy.
These are the questions to sit with.
Where in the architecture of your own life do you feel the most intense friction between opposing forces? When faced with that tension, do you naturally retreat into the rigid safety of an extreme, or are you willing to maintain the dynamic, athletic equilibrium required of the center?
It takes work.
And perhaps most importantly, look at an idea or a perspective that you fiercely oppose today. Can you identify the fragment of truth hidden within it, and can you better integrate opposing ideas into a clearer understanding of the whole?
These are the disciplines of a lifetime, and the path of the initiate continues.
It does. What's next for us?
In our next exploration, we will calmly turn the page to the Knight Rose Croix, where the journey will move from the mechanics of balance into themes of profound transformation, belief, and spiritual understanding.
I am deeply looking forward to dissecting that text. But before we part, I want to leave you with one final lingering paradox to consider, a thought that pushes the boundaries of the integration we have discussed today.
Oh, I like a good paradox.
If perfect balance, this profound inner and outer harmony of all opposites, is the ultimate goal of the Knight of the East and West, what is the physical state of that achievement?
That's a fascinating question.
Is the fully integrated life a state of perfect, absolute stillness, having finally neutralized all opposing forces? Or when we finally master the tension between the light and the dark, when we reach that perfect equilibrium at the center of the dialectic, do we rest, or is that the exact moment we finally possess the capacity to truly begin to move?
It is the mystery at the center of the balance.
Thank you for doing the demanding intellectual work with us today. Wisdom is rarely found by running to the edges. It is forged in the fires of the center. Keep holding the tension, and we will see you in the next deep